My name is Maximilian Bufardeci. I'm a graphic designer from Melbourne, but I have one side of the family is Italian, and I studied graphic design at Swinburne University. Also did a little exchange in Copenhagen at the Danish Academy there, and then I've worked in the design industry in Melbourne for I would say 3 or 4 years since university, and also did a year of an artist and designer residency in Italy. Melbourne is a pretty unique city in what it has to offer. It has a lot of culture, and so I think growing up around that has inspired me in a particularly unique way. Maybe if it's like, I think graffiti when I was even in primary school was like quite iconic and interesting when I was that age. And I think that was probably like my first introduction to typography, was just seeing that, catching the train into the city and seeing it on the way. I think it's hard to compare to other cities, probably only growing up in Melbourne. I think I was like 16 or 17. My mum took me to this exhibition at the NGV, and it was an exhibition of Les Mason's work, who I think is like quite iconic in the Australian design industry and history as well. And I think just like the amount that he got to do, you know, the amount of visual elements he used to express himself or the magazine or the client that he was working for in such a different amount of ways. Like that's, I think, one of the things that really drew me to design. And I primarily work in design, but I'm interested in art making too. And I think dabbling in both of them, it's important that I've defined what they are to me. So to me, design, I don't try to weave too much of my own voice into that work. I try to take the client's voice and emphasize it and make it look and talk in kind of the most authentic way possible and bring out those authentic parts. And then I think the time outside of that, when I'm engaging in a more artistic practice, I'm thinking more about my own experiences and how can I express my own voice on like certain topics. And so I think that's where I separate them. I think they can borrow from each other, particularly in art. I'm interested in art in public space and how art reaches people. And I think a lot of the time there's a lot of like socially orientated artwork that's made that is really impactful, but sometimes doesn't reach possibly the people that it could reach. And so sometimes I think when you're in design and you're designing for maximum impact in public space on a billboard or in an installation, I'm interested and curious about those strategies being applied to the type of artwork that is really saying something interesting or impactful. Experimentation, material experimentation and process is pretty essential to my work. I try to have like a loose structure to go through when I'm doing a project, just as kind of a framework, and then I bounce between that framework. So I'm never kind of tied to a process, but if I don't have anything, I let a certain process kind of guide me. I think like research in pretty much every project is important, and I think research can just take so many different forms that you know, every project might not have the same type of research, but I think it's always a nice place to start. And it could even be a conversation with the clients, like a return brief is a kind of research. I think you know, that research can just be conversational, and so yeah, I think that's something that seems to be consistent. I mean, of course, you need a making process as well. And I think the best times are when that making process starts with a lot of experimentation. And yeah, I mean, that experimentation can become really exciting. I think when you're moving things around and you start to get more and more energy, or you're making things and you make something that you're excited about, then that's a great way to keep on going, I think. I think with collaboration, it kind of opens up everything. It means you can make things that you wouldn't have really dreamed of or envisaged. And you can also bounce things off each other. So a collaborator could have an idea and you interpret that idea in a visual way. And yeah, there's so many, collaboration is so multifaceted. Collaboration can really surprise you and gives you results that are kind of beyond what you thought the project could have done, which is amazing. And then I think it also adds just a personal level where you're connecting with the people you're working with and you're building important relationships. And ultimately, I think that's really rewarding. You can even frame a design project with a client as a collaborator. If you're having lots of conversations and if you're, both really respecting each other. And I think that's a nice way to talk about the client-designer relationship. It meant a lot to me, for sure. I was at Fabrica the year before doing an artist and designer residency. And then they asked me to stay on to mainly work on that project. So it was, really meaningful that they particularly asked me to tackle that project. And it was meaningful to work on it and engage with the archive of the 800 residents who had been through there, conceptualize what the identity was going to look like and what we wanted to talk about, and talk to other residents and people who worked there about how to do that as well. It was a really hands-on, interesting project. At times there was a lot of responsibility because I felt like we had to do something that really properly represented all those people who went through that institution, and that was also kind of daunting, I guess. But it sort of culminated in this event where so many of them came and engaged with the event, with the lectures and talks and concerts, and with the identity as well. And I think when you see how much it meant to them, it felt like a job well done in some way. It was it really facilitated that. I mean, I think without an identity, it would have facilitated it too, but it feels nice that the design helped that kind of community feeling, especially for those who maybe hadn't been back to the residency in 20 or 30 years. It was sort of an open call to designers, photographers, artists, writers, but then all working on art projects. And so it really helped me probably develop a different type of thinking, a more artistic type of thinking that I hadn't looked at university or in practice before. And I think that diversity I really appreciate. And so much of that was just from learning from the other people who were there, who had different educations in different countries. And you were learning while you were there, and you were also learning while you weren't, because everyone was living in the same city in Italy. So even outside of that institution, just through talking and getting to know those people, you were learning from them. I think it was about creating a language that didn't champion one or the other. And it was the same direction that we wanted to go in when we thought about the history of Fabrica. There's been a lot of particularly famous people to come out of that institution, and for the reunion, we didn't want to highlight one or the other. You know, there's a few big names, but it was more about making this collective of 800, and within that collective they do films, they do performance, they do screenings. So it was kind of about making a language that encaptured all. We kind of like took those 800 names and then made it so that that typography would work as like type as image, and so then any image was built up from the letters of the 800 names. And it was kind of like, you know, everyone shapes the building or the output or this thing that is Fabrica, rather than we champion one or two or three great filmmakers or great artists that came out of it. So yeah, the design language was kind of like this, a unifier, I guess, that I think then houses those different categories with equality, rather than putting cinema on a pedestal, for example, or the performances on a pedestal. Yeah, there was definitely a lot of collaboration and conversation with other residents and designers. Like a lot of the photography, I collaborated with my roommate, who was another resident, Joe Haben, who was from the UK. And that was really nice, you know, to give him a sort of a photography brief and for him to respond to it in a particular way, in his own way. We also worked with Carlos Casas, who was the director of Fabrica at the time, and he kind of informed, I guess, a lot of the visual language and some of the stylistic stuff as well. So he was always giving us direction and kind of always there as a sounding board. And then there was the copywriting team, there was the production team. I mean, there's so many logistics. But I think like the resident group as well, the way that Fabrica worked was you were all kind of in the same room. And so I guess it felt also like a collaboration with all of those residents. As a young designer, like you get projects that you don't want to work on. That's hard sometimes, but it's also, I think, something that everyone probably needs to do, especially when you have things like rent and, you know, you need money for food. Like everyone has to do those jobs that afford you those things. I think there's also kind of like maybe a more mental side of things, like design and art can come from a really personal place. And so then I think when sometimes it doesn't work out, it can be really hurtful and upsetting. And I think getting to know that feeling and when that happens and how it happens has been probably good for me, and I'm better at handling that now. But I think that's definitely a challenge of a young designer. Like I think as a young designer, your references or the work that you're looking at that you think is really amazing is always like out of reach. It's always like 5 or 10 years ahead of you. And there's definitely a frustration in that, not being able to make something as good or as interesting or as energetic as what gives you energy or what you really respond to. So I think maybe accepting that and just knowing that it's like a long process of your work getting better. Getting to a point with my practice where maybe I can start to be more confident to approach people who I want to work with and really be intentional about the projects I want to work on. I'm interested in doing that more. I think it's also kind of daunting, but I think maybe as you do, or as I've done more projects, you get more confidence. And then if you want to put forward yourself, you sort of have confidence that you'll be able to do something interesting if they do end up saying like, yeah, we want to work with you. So I'm looking forward to that. but I'm also looking forward to continuing to learn under people who have been doing it for so much longer than I, and who also practice in a different way. Intentionality about like how to engage with people who are working in those spheres, and really engaging with like an audience that's in there. I think that always makes a project more real. I think in my experience, like sometimes my university projects that were pretty socially orientated were done in lockdown, and I felt that it lacked a bit of like real engagement. And it doesn't have to mean that the project is necessarily like 100% real, but I think that a lot of people are open to talking and doing primary research in that way. So I would say, I guess, I think a lot of the importance of like a socially orientated or politically orientated project is probably listening to a group and asking the right questions, and really listening to what they have to say and then responding to that. Let's say experimentation, creativity, and good relationships.